As it's Halloween season, let's talk about my favourite genre of games. Survival horror. Hi everybody, I'm Phil and you're watching UnCapt Gaming. Like the creatures that stalk its narrow, claustrophobic hallways, survival horror has more than once been presumed dead, only to rise up once again and surprise us. But whilst horror games have been enjoying something of an upsurge in popularity lately, with titles ranging from Evil Inside and Visage to multiplayer sensations Phasmophobia and Dead by Daylight, the vast majority of these games are not survival horror. This doesn't matter if you enjoy the games and have a good experience. There are so many fantastic horror titles and other titles that employ horror elements effectively that this has to be celebrated. But if we're talking specifically about survival horror, then there are certain requirements to be met. Putting down if a game is survival horror isn't always straightforward. On the one hand, there are hard and fast definitions of the genre, and on the other, its boundaries are blurry. Survival horror is not simply survival plus horror. Survival games usually involve the smart use of resources to craft defences and weaponry to overcome foes. Survival horror has minimal crafting and severely curtails resources in order to force players to choose what to conserve and when to fight. Survival horror typically involves protagonists who are everyman characters rather than action heroes, though they may evolve into that over a series. Resource management, ammunition and healing items will be scarce. The amount you can carry is also generally limited, making what you take and when you use it a strategic choice that can backfire much later in the game if you're reckless. Puzzle solving. These puzzles won't always be the most complex, but nor will they necessarily be isolated to specific puzzle rooms. You may find items that you don't have a use for until much later in the game, in a separate location, or find a puzzle that you don't obtain the solution to for some hours. Backtracking. Survival horror environments aren't small, but they're most often self-contained, with both puzzle elements and non-linear unlocking of areas, meaning that there's lots of cause to retread old ground. Emphasising evasion over combat. Scarce resources mean you can't kill every enemy, which forces you to choose wisely when to engage in combat and when to evade. There will still be jump scares and monsters, but typically tension and horror comes from these elements. Having to backtrack means deciding if you can spare the bullet to take down the enemies on the oft-used paths, or knowing you'll have to dodge them time and again. Resources getting low can build dread for a boss fight. If the game involves a pursuer, then there's the added angst of not knowing when he'll turn up, and unseen time limits on your actions and a further drain on resources. Plenty of games also borrow survival horror elements, including the original Tomb Raider games, Bloodborne, and more. These games though still fit into other genres, they're not survival horror games. Some games, such as the Last of Us series, arguably fit very neatly into the exact definition of survival horror, although the on-rails, forward momentum storytelling doesn't lend itself to backtracking. But it's not generally listed here because the plot, although steeped in horror both with the infected and the human enemies, is secondary to the character-driven storytelling. This isn't generally what people expect from survival horror, where the environments and the enemies are the main focus, and so it often falls out of the definition in most people's minds. If you're looking for recommendations of survival horror games to play, then the obvious go-to example is Resident Evil, as it effectively codified the genre. Other franchises worth trying are Silent Hill, Dead Space, Fatal Frame, Outlast, and The Evil Within. And a personal, surprise favourite of mine is Wales Interactive's Made of Scare. The Resident Evil series is not only the prime example of survival horror done right, but also arguably the prime example of it done wrong. The original games clung to a formula that worked, while still managing to add variety. The first Resident Evil was different to 2, which was different to 3, different to Code Veronica, whilst they were all recognisably built from the same mould. The Resident Evil remake is considered by many the perfect survival horror game, not only maintaining but improving upon the puzzles, resource management and exploration elements of the original game. Whilst RE4 was more of an action game, with resources less scarce and backtracking not so important, it was still rooted in horror and survival horror elements remained. There are many who consider this the best RE game, and even those who see it as where the series started to falter recognise its importance and effectiveness. RE5 and particularly 6 were action games with inconsistent, though still sometimes effective horror, but not survival horror. RE7 was seen as a return to form while shaking up the formula with a first-person perspective and human-ish enemies drawing on American Gothic and Texas Chainsaw style horror. The RE2 remake did an excellent job of building an oppressive atmosphere that charmed with the original, while still fitting with modern gameplay sensibilities such as over-the-shoulder controllable camera and precision aiming. On the other hand, the RE3 remake disappointed a lot of fans due to cut content, a lack of puzzles, and far less exploration and backtracking. RE8 built on what made 7 work. It was a lot more action heavy in the vein of RE4, but retained backtracking, exploration and resource management. Not all of the Resident Evil games are survival horror. Of those that are, not all are pure survival horror. But what makes them good or bad games isn't just about if they fall into this specific genre. RE4 is an excellent game with a lot of replay value, whose pacing would be disrupted by stricter adherence to the formula of the older games. Conversely, RE6's problems of chaotic combat scenarios and ridiculous set pieces that make fights feel overlong and contrived wouldn't be fixed by the addition of item boxes and more thoughtful puzzles. There's good survival horror and bad survival horror, but if it's good, then it's less noticeable if it bends the rules, rather than being good because it sticks perfectly to the rules. There's still a lot of potential in the world of survival horror. Whilst it's easy to turn a genre into a formula that can become stale, it should equally be easy, if done right, to take the elements that make good survival horror and combine them with innovation. Survival horror isn't about the camera angles or the perspective. It's not about how many locked rooms there are and whether it's necessary to enter them all. It's about whether the availability of resources, the environment you're in, and the things you need to do to progress make the enemies and the horror feel more imposing and claustrophobic, ratcheting up the tension, rather than letting you think that because of the weapon in your hand, maybe what's clawing at the door isn't too scary after all. Thanks for watching UnCapt Gaming. Don't forget to subscribe for more gaming comments and content. And if you enjoyed this, then give it a like. See you next time.